Let's get started. My name's Ted Stenstrom with Kensium. I'll be facilitating today. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. We had quite a few people sign up for this, so I'm sure we'll have some folks join as we get started. Excuse me. Today's conversation is about a shift that many commerce businesses, certainly a number of our customers, are already experiencing, where they will be very soon. Specifically, we're talking about the move from system integration to what we call true data orchestration across the organization. As commerce environments get ever more complex, the challenge is no longer just connecting systems together. It's about coordinating the data, the workflow, the decisions, and customer experiences across the entire business. So we're going to talk about that today. So rather than deliver just a traditional presentation, we really wanted to make this webinar today feel a little bit more like a conversation. We want it to be practical, we want it to be candid, and we really just want it to be genuinely useful for the audience today. So I'm joined by two incredible leaders in the commerce space. We have Dwayne from Shopify and Rahul from Kensium. And, you know, I've been in this industry for about 20 years myself, and commerce is really the secular growth story of this century, right? You go back to late 1990s, early 2000s, and it's always been driven by constant shifts in how businesses operate and how customers buy. And that's changed significantly over the past 20 years. Between the two of these guys, Dwayne and Rahul, I don't want to, I'm not saying we're old, but we've got about 50 years of experience between the two of them. But what really sets them apart is they're not just strategic, but they're very much practitioners. And what I mean by that is they've been in the trenches, living through every phase, every nuance, every change that we've seen in this commerce evolution firsthand. So they're the guys that have been breaking things, fixing things, and figuring out what actually works. They bring that what I call a rare mix of big picture thinking, very strategic thinking, combined with the ability to roll up their sleeves from an execution standpoint as well, which should make this a really fun conversation. It's definitely going to be a very real conversation. So Rahul, Dwayne, it's great to have both of you here. Before we get into the core topic, I just want to start with one simple framing question for the webinar, and that is why this conversation about connected commerce is especially relevant right now. So Dwayne, let me start with you. From your vantage point, what's changed in the commerce landscape and makes conversations about architectures and operating models even more important than they used to be?
Awesome. Yeah, I'll answer that quickly. Before I do, I just want to say thank you on behalf of Shopify to all of you participating today and listening to the conversation, to Rahul, Ted, Ricky from the Kensium team. Shopify is always honored to be in conversation with our partners, with our merchants, with prospects. We absolutely value conversations, not just as a way to share our opinions on commerce, of which we have many, but also to hear the opinions and challenges of others. So again, for those participating today in listening mode, please do ask questions in the chat, and Ted and others will bring those to be highlighted and answered. Because this is, I like the phrase practical and conversational earlier, and I think we will have a good conversation today. In terms of your question about what's changing, like I think that commerce used to optimize for channels, transactions, getting to a launch, perhaps some system level success. The graphic on the screen is showing some channels on the left, but by far these are not all the channels that commerce is active in, right? So we used to really optimize for the storefront, getting the storefront live, perhaps getting the storefront used by a lot of our customers. But one thing that's changing is that a lot of times took the form of channel-centric approaches, especially in manufacturing and distribution. We have a channel that serves small business. We have a channel that serves other distributors. We have a channel that might be including our physical branches. But we're just seeing this real proliferation of channels, marketplaces, subscriptions, the rise of social selling, the rise of agentic commerce as a channel, the blending of these types of channels. So what we're seeing is, as we have this channel proliferation, touch point proliferation, What we're seeing now is a need to orchestrate all of that. How do you orchestrate that in real time or near real time, so that what's happening in a marketplace becomes known to what's happening on the storefront or even to the factory floor? How do you build cross-system trust where the inventory in one system can trust the inventory of another system, or one system can trust that the trouble tickets are accurate and being brought to bear. We're seeing a lot more autonomous decisions rather than decisions by exception. And really, one thing that's constant is change, right? People talk about, constant change, perhaps constant chaos, but we're seeing just, there's no static moments in commerce anymore. Again, I go back to the proliferation of social selling and agentic commerce channels in the last 5 years. Those are two disruptive changes, at least in Shopify's merchant base, that commerce must now optimize for. So Rahul, in terms of maybe building on what I said, what are you seeing from brands that are trying to grow? Anything I said there that you agree with or disagree with?
No, I think I agree with everything. And in fact, from where I sit, the reason this conversation matters now is that businesses are no longer struggling with just storefront performance or channel expansion, which is what we used to talk about all the time. I think right now the struggles are real with respect to the coordination layer that sits behind the storefront, and the cost of disconnected operations, which is becoming impossible to ignore, right? So I think Ted was mentioning about my, the number of years of experience, or rather my age. So I would say that in my 20 years in e-commerce, I've seen companies go from managing a few relatively simple systems to operating across e-commerce, ERP, point of sale, WMS, marketplaces, B2B portals, customer service platforms, and several other systems, right? So this is the promise of composable commerce, right? Which we've been talking about the last few years. Everybody was talking about composable commerce, which is great. And the idea is to get the best system for the best job. So obviously the issue is not that any one of those systems is broken. The issue is that the handoffs between them are now critical to customer experience and operating efficiency, right? So today architecture shows up in business outcomes much faster than it used to. If systems are not coordinated well, you will feel that in fulfillment delays, inventory issues, pricing mismatches, manual work, and of course, leadership teams spending too much time reconciling instead of scaling, right? So I think the reason why I feel this conversation is very important right now is because the need today is not just to connect systems, but to create a more unified operational foundation across them. And I think that's what I hope to discuss with you today. So.
Yeah.
Got it. I love it. So what I'm hearing, what I hear you both saying is the pattern is pretty clear. So the tech stack is constantly expanding, but business is moving faster, and the cost associated with disconnected processes is just becoming increasingly hard to ignore. So let's focus in on integration first. So because integration, it absolutely created value. It's always been necessary to connect the tech stack. But the goal here, I think the goal of today's conversation isn't to say that integration was the wrong approach, right? It's always been the traditional approach, but the goal is more to understand where it starts to fall short in this new world. So Rahul, when people say we just need to integrate systems, what problem are they actually or typically trying to solve?
So I think the way I look at it is that the current challenges, the warning signs, are pretty visible, right? So the challenges that when people are trying to say we need to integrate systems, what they're usually trying to solve is a real business problem, right? So which could be around visibility or process continuity. The orders they want, they want the orders to flow, inventory to sync, customer data to move, and so on, right? In other words, they're simply trying to make sure that one part of the business does not operate in isolation from the other. And that instinct makes sense because integration has historically been the most direct way to eliminate obvious disconnects, right? So I think it's important to say this clearly, right? Integration absolutely solved important problems, and it still does, right? So and that's what integration is all about.
Got it. Got it. And just a couple of follow-up questions for you. Where does point-to-point integration still make sense in this environment?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I spent the last 15 years building and advocating for point-to-point integrations, and and I would have for a majority of that time I would have strongly argued that point-to-point was often the best option available, and it was direct, it was easy to understand, relatively straightforward to implement. I wouldn't say the easiest to implement, straightforward to implement, and often the most practical way to get two systems working together reliably. And it still makes sense when the use case is narrow, where it is stable, and the variance is very low, right? So if two systems need to exchange a well-defined data set and the workflow around that exchange is not changing often, then a point-to-point integration or a direct integration can still be perfectly appropriate.
Got it. I think we see that too, just to maybe put a finer point on that. When a system of reference like a static web page or a CMS is receiving information from a more dynamic system, the point-to-point integration could be really appropriate right there, right? Where it's not so much of an exchange or interchange that Rahul is talking about, but perhaps just by a single direction data flow. Like, do we keep a page updated with a status? Do we, present some relatively static marketing copy here? Can we pull from a data source just to display a single piece of information? Sometimes just a point-to-point integration right there to display that sort of information, I think makes sense. But what we're talking about here with product data or pricing or the customer status or an order status or return status, a lot of those are so dynamic that a more robust integration is appropriate.
Absolutely.
Right. Why was that the default answer for so many teams for so long?
I'll start, and again, Dwayne, please feel free to add. I mean, the reason it became the default is simple, right? It worked. It solved immediate pain. It was also concrete, familiar, and easier to frame. Teams can identify two systems and simply say, "Oh, we need them to talk," right? And that's a simpler conversation than stepping back and asking, how does the overall business process work, and how should it be coordinated across systems, people, timing, and decisions, right? So and for a long time, remember that the environment was very simple compared to what it is today, right? The move towards composable commerce made that you are now operating with several systems within your ecosystem, and earlier that was not the case, right? You had a lot of monolithic systems that did 90% of the work that was needed, and integration also became the default because it solved the first layer of problem very well, which is connectivity, right? So the challenge now is that the problem has moved up a level from connectivity to coordination to or what I would say is orchestration right now.
Got it. So Dwayne, just moving along, at what point does an integration-led approach stop being enough? Like when we're shifting into this commerce orchestration that Rahul's talking about?
Yeah, I think in some of the earlier days that we're talking about here, where there's more point-to-point integrations, exceptions were expected. And there is this idea that, and quite valid, that humans could handle the exceptions. And in the early stages of commerce journeys, I'm not even talking a transformation, just getting a kind of a site live as a new channel, much less a large transformation. The brands I worked with knew that there would be exceptions, and a lot of times I think they discounted how many of those exceptions there would be. And so when your architecture was designed around, human approvals and humans in the loop and humans, handling exceptions, that was okay, right? But now when we're thinking about, complexity, that produces, higher order volumes. It produces more service requests. It produces, more need to get information from third parties. The organizations just break under the exception processing, right? Kind of a practical example of this that I used to share with my B2B merchants is, everything was being bought on account terms, and so there'd be a single invoice at the end of the month. there were a lot of processes that ultimately generated an invoice that a buyer could trust. But as these B2B businesses were beginning to really explore e-commerce and transactional kind of drive-by sales from smaller B2B buyers, they need to start processing credit cards for the first time. And I would offer them guidance and advice that they should really, really get good early at processing credit cards, even if the volume's not heavy, because ultimately, if their organization, hasn't worked through all the exceptions that can't happen in the early days, their organization will get broken because of that.
Got it. So,
yeah. It could be true in the warehouse, right? Like, how do you do pick, pack, ship without exception? How do you, how do we start, if we're having the same type of exception, how do you build a system or an approach or an architecture that just handles that? So truly the critical ones are escalated for management, oversight, and decision-making.
Yeah, so more specifically, what limitations start to show up as we talk about scale of a business? What are those limitations and how do they show up?
Oh, I think the limitations start to look like, how many orders can we process per day? Not on the website storefront, but how many really get processed in the back office or in the warehouse? How quickly can we create new content in response to a market shift? That could be a natural disaster, it could be a regulatory change, it could be some sort of supply chain crunch. How quickly can you communicate that? I think a lot of times it starts to show up with delayed communication with prospects, buyers. It shows up with a lot more exception reports happening on the site and your supply chain. It shows up a lot of times with a lot more support requests. And the one that I would really encourage people to look out for is reduced buying behavior in really subtle ways. Like, what happens when that buyer who's been buying from you for 20 years starts to just receive some exceptions in their processing. Their orders are delayed a little bit. They probably don't tell you that they're going to stop ordering from you. They just stop ordering from you, right?
Telling their friends they're going to stop ordering from you.
Really reach some of that subtlety and and with the AI tools now and the data analysis tools, being able to say, oh, I can start to correlate my increased trouble ticket volume with my decrease in sales. I can start to correlate this 12-hour delay in order acceptance to a decrease in sales versus a 2-hour delay kind of thing. I think it starts to show up ultimately in the long tail, shows up in buying behavior.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. That's when I'm about to make a purchase and something goes wrong and I turn to my wife and say, never again. Like, I'm done with this brand, I'm done with this product, and I just never reach out to them again, right? Like, I think that's a lot of the risk here.
Exactly.
When do growing brands, or what do growing brands tend to realize too late in this process? And how can they get ahead of that?
I think that a lot of times as brands, are even very experienced brands, are undertaking this journey, they think that architecture is squiggly lines on a page that happens in the design process, right? It's like this is a pretty graphic on the screen right here, but I think all the architects in the call and others have seen data flow diagrams and lots of the spaghetti lines around this. And I think that's a problem. That I think really architecture is so much more than how do the systems integrate. It really represents your organization as well. And so I think brands, whether it's B2C, B2B, mixed, types of models, should really be considering business architectures, organizational architectures, technical architectures as well. And those aren't three standalone things. Those things are highly layered, right? But how we architect our business, what we're the classic, what are we selling at what price point, what locations, those types of architectural decisions, strategy, if you will, plays out into the organization. And organizationally, are we hiring for people who really run a tight ship where the processes are really consistent, or are we hiring for amazing firefighters and rock stars who are going to handle all these exceptions, right? Are we making those types of business and organizational architectural choices well before we get to IT and kind of the system diagram we see on the screen here?
Got it.
Sorry,
go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah, Dwayne, I would like to add that, the tipping point usually comes when the business needs coordination and not data exchange. And And you can get quite far with integrations when the job is simply to move information, right? But once the business starts needing, as you mentioned, exception handling, routing logic, multi-location inventory decisions, customer-specific pricing, B2B approval flows, or even like just simple things as real-time visibility across teams. I'm not talking about real-time visibility across systems, across teams. And that's where integration alone starts to strain. And that's where the maintenance costs increase, the businesses slow down, and teams start realizing that connected does not necessarily mean coordinated, right? I think that's when I think the brands start realizing that, okay, we probably should have done something about it a little while back.
Right. So when it's, too late, so to speak. So what I'm hearing, and this is a great segue, is integration has always been necessary, and it helped create and enable this concept of connected commerce, right? And that's how it was for many, many years. But as businesses scale, what I'm hearing, based on what you just said, especially, Rahul, is connected and coordinated aren't necessarily the same thing. So this gets pretty interesting because orchestration, which is what we're talking about here, sounds like a buzzword to me, right? It's not, doesn't sound practical. It sounds like another buzzword, and Lord knows there's plenty of those in this space. So how can you make that concept of orchestration versus integration a little bit more real? Dwayne, and I guess I'll start with you, Dwayne. How do you define orchestration in a way that's like actually meaningful or useful from a business standpoint?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that what it's not about, do we have the right APIs? Are we running sync jobs? Is the, kind of the data lined up, so to speak, or correct? I think a lot of times orchestration starts with, a single operational source of truth. Like what is our source or sources of truth that we can all trust? Do we have shared definitions of product, price, customer, order, inventory? Do we have a known set of things that we can decide about now without always requiring manual reconciliation later? Most of what I just said there, by the way, is the classic things that you might do in a discovery. Like let's really discover your readiness of product, price, customer, order type of things. And when I used to, be a business analyst and a functional lead, those were full rich day workshops, sometimes week-long workshops on each topic to really get to that. And no surprise to anyone in this call who's participating as a listener, those shared definitions can be incredibly hard to come by, right? Everything from, what's the product identifier? It's not always a SKU or UPC. It could be what your number one seller over the last 30 years has been calling it. And there's a lot of different things. So I think, orchestration is about, having those shared definitions. It's about having governance, at data creation, not just, downstream data use. Orchestration most of the time is in real time, right? I think about what is a music orchestra. It's a collection of highly skilled players who all have the freedom to play however they want. But they're being orchestrated by a conductor who can hear that there's a little bit of sound weakness over here. So he's calling for more bassoon, or he hears that the drum is a little bit behind on the pace. So he calls for that to speed up a little bit. And it's all happening in real time, right? And as we're sitting there watching it as participants, but also as the musicians, are playing. And ultimately, I think, getting ready for kind of this orchestration is, being more AI ready by design. We haven't said anything in AI yet. It's been 25 minutes into the call, but again, defining back to defining product, customer, order, inventory. Not only defining it, how we present it on a site or transact with it, but how do we present it to these AI agents as well?
Yeah, and Dwayne, if I can add,
sure.
The simplest way I explain to folks that ask me about integration versus orchestration is integration asks, can these two systems talk to each other? Whereas orchestration asks, can the business run cleanly across these systems? Right? I mean, that's the fundamental shift that I see. In other words, in practice, an orchestration is about where the logic lives, how workflows are triggered, how exceptions are handled, and how visibility is maintained, and how decisions are going to get coordinated across the technology stack. So it's not about moving data, which is what integration does. It's about making the operating model work across systems in a way that can scale. Right. So that's a lot of technical words, but yeah, I think the way when the orchestration is about can the businesses run cleanly across the systems. So
Yeah, I love that.
I like the definition, Rahul. Like I think integration is about systems talking to each other. That was a good way to say that. And orchestration is, not only more than are they talking to each other, are they playing nice in the sandbox? Are we learning? Are each system kind of learning from this? Are the systems, with good human intervention, evolving to, be more truthful, be more accurate, decisions happen quicker, more than just talk to each other in a very, static way.
Got it. And so I love that. I love that from both of you. Rahul, can you walk us through maybe a practical example of this, like order flow, inventory fulfillment, customer communication? Where does orchestration actually improve visibility and reduce friction in a real environment?
Yeah. I mean, the way I look at it is that, in practice, orchestration looks like a business workflow that is intentionally coordinated across systems, right? So rather than an integration which feels like it's left to a chain of disconnected handoffs, right? So if you rely only on disconnected integrations, the logic behind those decisions often ends up scattered. Some in the e-commerce platform, sometimes those decisions are in the ERP, some are in the middleware, some in spreadsheets, and some in people's heads, right? So the idea is that orchestration improves that by creating a very deliberate flow across the systems, right? So it improves visibility because teams can see where an order is, why a decision is made, and where an exception occurred, right? So it reduces friction, and this is actually one of the exact problems that we address in Omnify CX. I'm going to shamelessly keep plugging our new solution, Omnify CX, here, right? So the idea is that we use a unified data and orchestration layer to normalize the flow across the systems, right? And automate the workflows such as like order routing, fulfillment, and invoicing without burying the logic in 10 different places, right? And a good example of that is what you're seeing on the screen here, which is an order flow is a perfect example because that is where I see most businesses are going to discover how much complexity is actually hiding beneath the surface, right? A customer placing an order on the storefront, but that's just really the starting point. From there, the business may need to validate the customer, apply pricing rules, confirm inventory availability, determine the best fulfillment location, push the order into the ERPs, trigger the warehouse processes, and then manage the invoicing and keep and most importantly, while they're doing all that, keep the customer informed along the way. Right? And if these decisions are scattered across multiple tools and hard-coded integrations, that process becomes very fragile, right? So the idea is that if they're orchestrated intentionally, the flow becomes much more reliable and easier to manage. And that's where we are talking about orchestration versus integration.
Yeah, which is a pretty meaningful shift, just listening to you talk. Because we're not just talking about the technology plumbing anymore, right? We're talking about how the business actually runs. We're talking about processes and workflows, which are what comprise the business, and then aligning these systems behind the scenes. But aligning systems requires orchestration of the data across those systems. So this is a pretty big shift. And is this the point at which architecture stops? It stops being just an IT conversation, if we talk about it from an organization standpoint, and really starts showing up in the boardroom, right? This becomes more, these are business discussions much more than they're technical discussions. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the idea is that if you're really looking at, I think Ricky has a slide up there, architecture as a business enabler. Right. So the idea is that when companies discover that they have too much logic buried in too many places, right? When they usually discover that when they're trying to change something, a new fulfillment rule, you're trying to enter a new market or a new channel and so on. And that's when the hidden complexity becomes visible, right? So integrations, tell at this point, orchestration is what's going to tell the business how the flow should actually run, right? So I would frame it this way, right? Architecture determines how expensive your growth is going to be. Right? If the architecture is right, businesses can launch faster, adapt faster, and scale with more confidence. Now, if the architecture is wrong, every new channel, workflow, every business model creates more operational drag, right? So for business leaders, this is not really an IT elegance conversation, right? It's not about simplifying systems and so on. It's a speed, resilience, visibility, and cost of change conversation.
Yeah, when do you think it actually starts showing up? Like when does, I'll call it bad architecture, right? You may or may not know that at the time, but when does it start showing up in terms of revenue and growth performance for a business?
Dwayne, you want to take that, or
Yeah,
I'm
for sure. I don't know if there's any one indicator when it shows up. I've had prior clients who are 100 to 150 years old and built businesses that lasted. They endured 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, and they're just now in the last, let's call it 5 to 10 years, really undergoing wholesale transformations. Many of these are not just customer experience transformations about what's happening on the site. It's truly a quote to cash transformation. It's truly a lead to cash transformation. So it's an end-to-end sales transformation. And so I think it can show up anytime in the maturity journey. Sometimes it's like, it just like you build the architecture and right away it's just lots of breaking that's happening right after you launch a site. Other times you have a 100-year-old business and you just know your business is constrained. So I don't know if there's any one indicator to this. I will say that the consequences of getting this right really do come down to what's on the page here. Like, getting the architecture right could allow your business to maintain pace with the rapid change that we're seeing across channels. It could allow you to have the flexibility to engage in these new transaction channels, social selling and agentic. Again, did you have an architecture that enabled you to put your products there or transact in those channels? Do you have resilience in terms of if one of your back office systems fails or type of thing? And then ultimately, do you have the kind of end-to-end visibility of what's happening? On the prior slide, we talked about that linear view. There's so much that used to happen with the systems of the architect. It's like, okay, we accept an order, and then at the moment of checkout, we're doing a real-time price check, from the cart and checkout, an order simulation, or the order is accepted. And then we have to figure out, do we have the inventory, or do we have a way to fulfill this? I see, really, I think forward-thinking merchants completely rethinking that. And an example might be, instead of doing configure price quote, accepting the order and then figuring out, can we build it? They actually build an architecture that's starting to help the buyer work through the configure price quote process, and instead of generating a custom SKU, maybe recommend a stocking SKU. And a lot of times the buyer can buy that. They didn't know that stocking SKU is available, or they're willing to maybe have an inch less in length and take a stocking SKU. Or one of my clients was a large paint company, and being able to see inventory at the independent branch locations before the buy happens allowed them to use the system to say, oh, we can actually transact this order, but instead of providing it from supplier A, we're going to provide it from supplier B. That's one block away. Or perhaps having a system that allows those independent retailers to trade inventory and be made financially whole same day, not on like net 7 or net 90. Those types of things. Those architectural decisions, well before making good decisions around that, well before you design a site to present it to a buyer, has enabled that paint company to have just extreme flexibility. In COVID, they were able to stand up a consumer channel very rapidly because they did the years of architectural work that allowed them to just move right when that happened.
They didn't, and they suffered the consequences. So let's talk a little bit about the journey. I love everything you just said, and it sounds great. The examples you're providing, that's where I want to get to. So what do I do? Like, you're also scaring the pants off me too if I'm in a situation where I'm not there yet. Like I guess I'll pass it back to you, Rahul. If I'm in a situation where I want to assess where I am today, how should I start thinking about this? How should I start thinking about maturity? Like, if I want to get to what Dwayne's talking about, which sounds great, where does that start? What do I do?
It's interesting that at one point, not too long ago, I I was working with a customer that had almost like 18 different integrations to various channels, selling channels, and so on. And how all of those were connected was how we actually internally, even at Kensium, we determine maturity, right? So today, I would definitely not think that way. I think I would think about maturity not in terms of how many systems are connected, but it would be in terms of how the business actually runs, right? So I would explain maturity in four simple stages, right? The first one is disconnected, right? Where the systems are largely operating in silos and teams rely heavily on manual work. And yes, believe it or not, we still have businesses that are operating in this stage as well, right? But a majority of them, luckily, are in the integrated stage, right? This is the second stage where the systems can exchange data, but the workflows still rely on fragmented logic, custom workarounds, and limited visibility. And the third stage is coordinated stage, right? So in this stage, what happens is the businesses start to standardize how the workflows are operating across the systems, and there's better control over where the logic and decisions live, right? So you're coordinating everything. And the fourth, and I'm saying final stage as of today, I'm sure there'll be something else that will come out in the next year or so with AI coming in. But in the orchestrated stage, I think this is where the businesses have a much more deliberate operating model across the technology stack with clear governance, better visibility, and more scalable automation, right? So the key is to assess maturity by operational behavior, which is how fast can it change, how visible is the flow, and how much depends on your manual intervention versus how confidently you can scale, right? So maturity is less about the number of integrations and more about the business's ability to coordinate workflows, handle exception, and change with confidence. Right? So
Yeah.
that's
So for everybody listening, this seems like a good sort of self-check. Are you mostly connecting systems today, integrating systems, or are you actually coordinating workflows across the business? And Rahul, does that mean I have to rebuild entirely? Is that what you're telling me? If I'm in a situation where I feel great because I've got 20 integrations and I've connected all my systems together, do I have to throw that out and start from scratch? Like, where do I go from there?
So first, let me answer and put everybody at ease. No, most companies do not need to rebuild everything, right? In most cases, this is much more about sequencing and prioritization and deciding where the coordination matters most. So I would say, the way I would look at it is that, for a business, how does a business what tells a business that they're ready for that next stage, right? So the signal that a business is ready for the next stage is usually not technical, as I mentioned, right? So it's usually pain based, right? It's operational. So for example, manual reconciliation is rising, right? Change is slowing down, exceptions are increasing every time. You're dealing with orders that don't flow through the system smoothly, and so on. And teams are no longer able to trust the same version of the truth across the systems that they have, right? So I think you get the point in terms of like when you're ready for moving to the next stage,
Yeah.
right? And at that point, your best option, I would say, for most businesses is to usually identify the highest friction workflows, understand where the value is being lost, and then modernize intentionally in stages, right? So most companies can make meaningful progress without a massive transformation on day one, right? I mean, we all love the big bang approaches where replace every system, come with all new tech stack, but the amount of disruption that causes to businesses is not worth it. So I would say, yeah, make meaningful progress with identifying areas that cause the most friction, and then start working towards that.
Got it. So the takeaway here, I think, is architecture isn't just about what we'll call technical elegance, right? It's about creating speed. It's about creating control across these workflows and developing room to scale and grow as well. So again, I want to keep this practical. That's what we committed to the audience. So in the interest of being just a little bit more practical about this, if you're sitting there in the audience thinking, this is exactly where we are today, we've got integrations and we've got connected systems, what's the next natural step? Like, where do we start or where do we go from there? So Dwayne, from your perspective, I'll go back to you. What should leaders be asking internally right now to understand whether or not their architecture is helping them or actually hurting them at this point?
Yeah, I have a series of questions that I would ask my clients when I was a consultant, and it would really give me
Sure.
insights into their relative readiness. I would never ask it right at the start of the discovery. It would typically be a day or two in, or several facilitated sessions in, and during those early sessions, I would hear, there'd be several C-suite officers in the room, including a CIO, a chief digital officer, perhaps a chief transformation officer. And then 3 or 4 days in, I would just ask a question around product or customer data, and I would just say, over lunch, can someone just generate an export of product data for your top 50 most sold products, and let's talk about after lunch. I'd say 1 in 100 companies could do that, right? Like to be able to quickly turn around a request for product data for 50 SKUs fully attributed was a challenge. And a lot of times that caused a lot of uncomfortable glances in the C-suite, because the CEO had been hearing from the CIO how well their Salesforce or SAP implementation had been going, and then they could not produce a basic set of product data. I would go ahead and further rub on that wound a little bit by asking about the same thing for the top 50 customers. Can you produce, a report of who your top 50 customers are, segmented by sales, segmented by location, segmented by something kind of meaningful, right? I'd continue to pull that thread around, who are your top 50 salespeople and what are they selling into who? And if those answers are not available in the order of minutes or seconds, your architecture is holding you back. Right?
How do you tease out, just on that note, how do you tease out when it's, you mentioned, you sort of name dropped a couple of systems there, good systems, and this isn't these are good systems in their own right, but when do you start to tease out what is a system issue versus like an operational model issue?
Yeah, well, I think some of the questions, it's some of the questions here. If I would ask that question about, can you provide an export of your top 50, product data for your top 50 SKUs? If there are delays in producing that, then this types of questions starts to play out. Like, is the process logic living in SAP ERP, or is it living in Rahul's head? Right, kind of thing. How easily can we launch or change workflows? And that could be like, well, we have to get everything just right in the spreadsheet and upload it, but if we have one character error, it's going to fail. I don't know, is that a data structure issue? Is that a system issue? So I think, back to your point on the prior slide, finding that, Rahul's point on the prior slide, finding these top pain points, and probably around product, price, customer data, order data, shipping, potentially around your own internal employee base, and then asking these types of questions will uncover a whole lot, right? Like number 4 on this screen is huge. Like, how much of our architecture depends on tribal knowledge? Historically, a lot, right? Even currently now, a lot. There's, the organizational glue is what, there's no record of this organizational glue, right? But in an AI world, tribal knowledge still remains very, very important. But that tribal knowledge comes out of people's heads, out of their personal hard drives, into the AI engines, and it's less about Rahul having the answers based on 30 years of serving our best customer, and a whole lot more about did we get that tribal knowledge into a system that others can learn from, add to, complement, type of thing.
Good. Yeah. No, I that all makes perfect sense. Go ahead, Ron.
I was going to add one more thing to what Dwayne was saying in terms of the questions he would ask the C-suite. I would actually, one of the things that I do in my discovery is that, yes, ask the operational folks, the warehouse manager, the accounting person, or the customer service person, in terms of how much manual reconciliation, how much manual process do they do every day behind the scenes just to keep the customer happy. Right?
Yes. Yes, I found so much value in my consulting days of talking to the 30-year branch employee, and not necessarily the person facing the customer, the person in the warehouse doing the picking, the person driving the route truck. And that's not to say that the C-suite is not important, but they're most of the time uninformed, because the line level employee is telling a story to the first level of management, telling a story to second level management. By the time you're 6, 8, 10, levels deep, there's this kind of gray suit effect. And the gray suit effect is what was happening at IBM for all those years. You know, the CEO of IBM had a collection of gray suits around him, you know, messaging, and the true leaders at the IBM did not know what was happening out in the field. And so, yeah, I think some of the things here is to when you think about where does this process logic live, or how much depends on tribal knowledge, and number 4, like that those answers don't come from VP sales or, you know, chief strategy officer or chief revenue officer. Those answers actually come from line level, field deployed 30-year employees, and that's where all the value is in this.
Yeah, I love that. Or her. We had Ginny there for a while at IBM too.
For sure.
But let me I've got an eye towards the clock here. I want to leave some time for questions. And you remind me, Dwayne, I was watching Undercover Boss last night, actually, and that guy is on the floor talking to people and shocked by some of the things that are happening at the lion level versus the conversations he's having in the C-suite. So it very much resonates. Because that really is, those are the folks that know. Those are the folks know what the problems are, the challenges are, the impacts, and the rest of it. But it's just tribal knowledge, right? And that costs real money at the end of the day. But if we just move on to orchestration, as we move towards this concept of orchestration, Rahul, I'll throw it back to you. Where do we start? Like, we've talked about systems, we've talked about workflows, we've talked about pain points, and I love that analogy. We've talked about data. Where do I start mapping? Like, what is the starting point here?
I think the first thing I would say is, do not start with platforms, start with workflows, right? So look at the business processes that matter most and break most often, right? Order capture to fulfillment, inventory synchronization, B2B approval workflows, and so on, right? So, or even just something, you know, very straightforward as company account management, right? Once that is clear, the next step would be to really identify where friction is highest, right? Where visibility is weak, or logic is duplicated, and so on, right? So, and from there, you prioritize the orchestration opportunities that will create the most business value, rather than trying to redesign everything at once, right? So
Got it.
I'll also ask a hypothetical question, right? I mean, where do you start? Do you start with systems, workflows, pain points, or data, right? So, you know, my own thinking has changed over time here, right? Earlier in my career, I would have started by asking which systems need to be connected, right? Today, after seeing 15 painful years of building integrations, I start by asking which business flows need to be governed better, right? Even if it's about product creation, I always talk about, you know, what's your workflow? How are you creating your product? You know, where does it originate? Who populates the marketing information? Who gets the pricing information? What about the inventory data, and so on? So there is workflows and orchestration everywhere, right? So I would always start with workflows and pain points. Systems and data matter, but if you start there in isolation, you can miss how the business actually operates, right? So the workflow is what tells you where the systems, data, rules, and decisions need to be coordinated.
Got it. Yeah, I'm really getting a theme here. This really is centered around the workflows across the entire business. Systems are the automation aspect of it, but we're really looking at workflows first and foremost. So I want to close with a forward-looking question. And of course, Dwayne, I'm going to come back to AI, right? Because this is definitely the thing that we hear about every day. It's the thing that everybody's talking about. And that's naturally where this conversation leads, because that's where commerce is heading. AI, you know, surfaces is a part of that, but AI automation across the business is a big part of that as well. So with all the talk about AI, Dwayne, I'll throw this one over to you. How should leaders be thinking about the relationship between AI and this concept of commerce architecture as we're talking about it?
Yeah, AI is such a topic. Maybe we'll do this in one of our follow-up conversations to just talk about maybe Shopify AI or AI within our merchant base. I think, you know, the way leaders should be thinking about it is like a couple of different things. One, we are very, very early days, right? I think we're not even to the kindergarten level of kind of the journey yet. Like, just over the last couple of years, you know, we went from like, what is this AI thing, to this explosion of OpenAI and Anthropic and Copilot, but we are still so just very, very early days. So, so I think leaders should be thinking about that. Like, we don't know where the future is going to go, so let's be open to all sorts of outcomes. Let's be cautious with our investments, but let's be trying to find the high impact investments. We definitely see that I think that AI can provide rapid proofs of concept. I'd be thinking about, if I was an executive, and I coach a lot of executives, spend a lot of time, is like, if you could imagine your perfect world, what would it be? Just type that into the AI engine and see what happens, right? See what kind of recommendations come back. Be open to that, right? I think it's, away from the technology too, it's important for executive teams to be thinking about the personality types that your organization might need to succeed in an AI world. Like, are we using people with curious personalities? Are we using people that are open to change? Are we engaging with people who say, yes, I can, versus, oh, I could never? And then, are those people architecting the processes, workflows, systems that Rahul's been talking about for the last hour? So these are all starting points around where this goes. I think maybe a closing point too around this is, resist the temptation to think that you are going to become an AI native company or AI driven company. I think many companies have world-class products, they have world-class people, and the temptation to be an AI first company, kind of gets all the raves. You can post about it on LinkedIn, you might get some press coverage, but if you're a 150-year-old paint company, you've done something right. And then the question is, like, how do I dig my moat deeper, wider, set the moat on fire? Like, how do I keep this moat going and use AI to do that, versus completely rethinking how do I become an AI first paint business? Doesn't hold,
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, let's wrap up. I appreciate that. Let's wrap up with just a few sort of key takeaways, and then I just want to get some final thoughts from the two of you, and then we can open it up for questions. We'll have a few minutes for that. So just in closing, here's the things that I've heard throughout the conversation. Integration connects systems, orchestration enables outcomes. That's been a theme I've heard throughout this conversation from both you, Rahul, and from you, Dwayne, as well. Architecture is not just a technical concern anymore, right? It is truly, it's required for core growth and to support these operating models in the future that we're talking about. And for most businesses, what I'm hearing, which is a little bit of a relief, is it's not a massive rebuild, right? It's really getting clearer on the workflows and the data and the decisions and the coordination that has to happen across the businesses, versus, do I have the right systems in place? Which it's an evolution, right? Integration was a good answer for a long period of time. That's where things started. But to get to the next step, I really need to look at the workflows across the business that are supported by these connected systems. So it's much more of an evolution than a rebuild. But with that, I'll just ask for final thoughts from you, Rahul, and then Dwayne, from yourself, and then we can close this webinar down, and then we can open it up for a few questions.
I think my closing thought would be that most businesses do not need to start by replacing platforms, right? So they need to start by understanding how work actually moves through their business, right? And in my 20 plus years in commerce, I've seen every phase of this evolution, from disconnected systems to integration-led growth to the much more complex environments businesses are running today. And the businesses that scale best over the next few years will not simply be the ones with more systems or more automation. They'll be the ones with clearer operational model across those systems, and one that creates visibility, control, and the ability to evolve, right? And in fact, and I'll say this openly, right? AI, Dwayne was mentioning about AI, and it has reinforced my own evolution, the evolution in my own thinking, right? Today, with AI in the picture, the value shifts even more towards having a coordinated, governed, and trustworthy operational foundation, right? Because that's what allows AI to do more than just observe. If you're really talking about doing all the things that everybody is talking about nowadays with agentic commerce and so on, you need to make sure that you have data that is coming across from your ERP, from your warehouse, from your e-commerce systems that have the promotions and everywhere else, right? So I think that this is also the reason why we become so focused on unified data models and workflow orchestration, especially within Omnify CX. So if you want AI to operate meaningfully, you need a consistent foundation underneath it. And the key is for AI to plug into business process that's already visible and reasonably well coordinated. And I think we start with the workflows, and and if we basically ensure that the workflows are right, everything else seamlessly can be built on top of it. That's a strong foundational architecture that you need.
I love it. And then in 30 seconds or less, Dwayne, from your perspective.
I'd agree with all that. I'd even say that the way to get started is just remove things. Like, and because every more members of the orchestra require more coordination. One fewer person actually has many degrees of less coordination. Similar with systems. So have a critical eye in these workflows Rahul's talking about. Do we really need Susie in accounting to continue to approve this? Or have we actually taken all the exceptions out of this 20 years ago and it's just a kind of an artifact? So removing approval steps, removing approval people, removing this little tertiary system over here that's not important to the process. Like have a way to get started is not to build anything new or integrate anything new, or orchestrate anything new. Actually remove something, much like our lessons in life. Like you can do a lot in your journey in life, by watching what you eat, removing soda, sugar, these sorts of things. Similar analogies in this type of thing. Remove, do less, do better kind of analogy here.
Super. Now we're a little bit short on time here from a question standpoint. I don't know if there's one or two that we have time to answer.
Okay, Here goes one question. For businesses that already have several systems in place, what is the best place to start if they want to move forward in orchestration without creating a massive transformation project?
I think the way I was looking at it is, start again. I'm probably going to repeat some of this, but the simple thing is to start with the workflows, look at which ones are causing the most pain, identify the systems that are involved in those workflows, and then start simplifying it. I think Dwayne said it best, start removing things, right? So eliminate that, get a centralized orchestration foundation, and then take it forward from there.
Okay, we also have another question then. If we have good architecture, what should we think about in terms of AI and automation?
I'll start, and so I think the way I look at it is that once you have a strong architecture and a foundation, start thinking about what can be automated with AI, right? So the idea is that start eliminating the manual processes, even the automated systems, and start adding intelligence to that. You should start thinking about can you reduce your customer service costs? Can you reduce your can you optimize your inventory? In terms of what's being ordered, what's being sold, and so on. Can you start identifying opportunities for upsells to existing customers and so on? So the idea is that you can do that when all these systems are connected, and then you're adding AI on top of it.
Got it.
You would like to add anything to that? Yeah.
No, I think that's a great answer. Is again, think about where value is going to be delivered to customers, to employees, to supply chain partners, right, trade partners, and find low risk, high reward, potential, and then go after that in a pretty unconstrained way. If you claim that your architecture is good, prove it, and prove it with some questions I asked about product and customer, or prove it by picking off a pain point that everyone just kind of knows about, the sacred cow, and go after it.
Perfect. I love it. That's probably a great place to stop. I just want to thank you both for participating today. Everybody that joined us today. I learned a lot. I thought it was a great conversation. We're going to use this to kick off a webinar series. So I do think, AI in its own right, that's something maybe we can address next. So keep on the lookout for that. And with that, we'll close this down. The webinar is available after the fact, and then any additional questions can be sent to Ricky or myself directly, and we'll come back and answer those for you as well. But thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, bye.